All right, guys. So I wanted to cover this with quite a bit of data, and I believe I've provided enough here. So I have two articles, a chart, and an explanation of that chart, or at least the spike, and I'll elaborate on that when I get to it, to go over here. Um, so I've had quite a few familial disagreements lately about how, well, from their perspective, things were so much worse back in their day when it comes to cost of living, cost of specific things like going to college, health insurance, all that good stuff. And so, what tends to be the case, in my experience, is it really depends on the person. But if the person came from like a relatively impoverished background, they'll tend to be highly biased, and their framing will be based on their anecdotal experience. So they will believe sincerely that things were so much worse, and that, everyone these days should be happy, right? So in order to get out of this anecdotal thinking and this like very narrow lens in which people look, which is just based on their own personal experience, and there's a whole lot of like information they're just not privy to. So, in order to get out of that, you actually go to reliable data. We have this data, it's been accessible for many, many years. And that's what we're going to do here. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and jump into the first one. I already have it up. You're not imagining things. Your grandparents had it easier than you. This was by Sharon McMahon on April the 8th of this year. Standing in the Rose Garden and holding a red Make America Great Again hat, President Donald Trump announced that he had very good news for the country. My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day, he said. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again. For decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far, both friend and foe alike. Those years were over, Trump said. Jobs would no longer be stolen or U.S. factories ransacked by foreign leaders and foreign cheaters, he told the crowd seated on the grass. With a half dozen large American flags blowing in the breeze, Trump announced that he would sign an executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on about 90 countries and locales, including uninhabited islands, whose shores teem not with tired, poor, huddled masses yearning to breathe free, but instead with penguins. Since April 2nd, the stock market has been in a free fall, and Trump continues to threaten even more tariffs on China, which would bring the tariff on some Chinese goods to more than 100%. Despite the market's error, Trump has stayed the tariff course, saying that tariffs will return the American economy back to the times when manufacturing was booming and a factory job paid enough that a worker's wife could stay home with the kids. But here's the thing no one is talking about. The manufacturing jobs of yore paid enough to sustain the average family on a single income, and that is no longer true. The jobs that many of our grandparents worked at often no longer provide a living wage for a single individual, let alone a family of four. Wages have not kept pace with what it costs to live a middle-class lifestyle. Why U.S. manufacturing moved abroad. High pay in factory jobs and wide public support of unionization led to a boom in manufacturing jobs in the decades following World War II. Because of the war, the production capacity of much of Europe and Japan was greatly reduced, and the United States picked up the slack. American manufacturing peaked in 1979 when nearly 20 million people were employed in the sector. At the time, this was more than a quarter of all employment in the U.S., America is one of the world's top producers of cars, aircraft, and steel. The reason for the decline of manufacturing is multifaceted. The stagflation of the 1970s gave way to a recession in the early 1980s. Other countries finally rebuilt their capacity after the war, and the world was increasingly automated. Jobs began to shift overseas due to lower labor costs. Another reason for the shift was that Japanese manufacturing became superior to the factories in the United States, and so American companies began outsourcing their manufacturing to Japan. Shipping goods internationally also became much faster and cheaper in the post war era, making it easier for companies to make something abroad and ship it to the US. What a factory job could provide during the industry's prime. I'm sure you've heard tell of the time when a father clocked into his job at 9 a.m., worked for 8 hours, and then when work was done, rolled into the driveway of his 3-bedroom house in a new Chevrolet. Meanwhile, his progeny were being lovingly cared for by a stay at home mother who had meatloaf waiting in the oven upon his arrival. Often, men worked at their factory jobs for many decades and then earned a pension which allowed them to retire comfortably. How did they do it? Life in general was cheaper, and wages have not kept up with rising costs. In 1950, the average factory worker made about $1.47 per hour, around $3,000 per year. Today, the average manufacturing job across all roles outside of supervisory positions brings in about $28.92 per hour. At the average hourly wage, a worker would end up making about $58,000 for the year, assuming they took a 2-week vacation. It's easy to look at these numbers and think that people should be able to keep up. They are making nearly 20 times what the average factory worker was in 1950, but the evidence shows otherwise. The average home in 1950 cost $7,354, about 2.5 times the average yearly income of a factory worker. A typical home in 2025 costs $357,000, and that is just an average from around the country. In many large metro areas, one could not purchase an average home for this price. Rather than costing 2.5 times their yearly pay, the average home is now more than 6 times the average factory worker's income. Homebuyers in 30 states and DC need a 6-figure income or household income to afford even a typical home. That's an 80% increase in what someone needed to make to be able to comfortably buy a home in 2020. A buyer looking to purchase a new vehicle in 1950 would expect to spend about $1,299, or 43% of their annual income. In 2025, the average price of a new car is $48,461, or 84% of the average factory worker's income. Tuition was also very different for our grandparents. The average undergraduate tuition fees at a public university in 1952 to 53 were about $150, while at private institutions they were $550. This would amount to about 5% of their yearly take-home cash. Now, that undergraduate degree will run in-state students about $11,610 a year. That's about 20% of the average factory worker's annual earnings. And that is just tuition, not including room and board, books, and the like. Private universities have a higher price tag. Tuition alone averages $43,350, nearly 75% of a manufacturing employee's salary. Healthcare is one of the most expensive things Americans pay for, a cost that's impossible to compare with that of the average household in the 1950s, when the insurance system was quite different from today's. In 1950, the average family paid about $200 to $225 annually for medical care. This included premiums and out-of-pocket costs. It is a completely different story now. Since 2014, insurance costs have gone up by 52% for a typical family. In premiums alone, the average family pays nearly $6,100 each year, while some pay just over $14,000. This doesn't include copays or anything else, just premiums, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And out-of-pocket costs, our forebears paid around 6% a year, but today the average manufacturing worker can expect to pay 10 to 25% of what they earn just for health insurance premiums. And these numbers don't even touch another significant expense for 2025 families that simply wasn't a consideration for the 1950s: daycare. The national average cost of daycare is $11,582 a year, or about 20% of the average factory worker's salary. Why are things so much more expensive? Your grandparents were better able to afford the basics like housing, and none of the prices in this piece include potential increases due to tariffs. You are worse off than they were because wages no longer match the average cost of living anymore. In 2018, the average wage had the same purchasing power as it did 40 years prior. A study in 2024 showed that for every pay increase lower wage earners got, the income of top earners increased even more. Top earners make almost 5 times more than lowest income workers, or 489% as much. A top earner is someone in the highest income bracket. Many factors contribute to this wage stagnation. Labor unions are not as common, leaving workers with fewer resources and less power in contract negotiations. Automation has taken over some jobs, and the people at the top make decisions that benefit them, adding to income inequality. The average worker is getting priced out of what used to be an average lifestyle because even though they are working just as hard, their pay is barely growing. With all this in mind, and even if we create millions of new manufacturing jobs in the US and take back control from overseas companies, it's clear that we won't soon return to a bygone era in which the average factory worker could care for their family on a single income. Moving to the second. This is from the Economic Policy Institute, and the report is by Lawrence Michel, Elise Gold, and Josh Bivens, January the 6th, 2015. This is relatively outdated, but you could easily imagine like the difference in time and the 10 years anyhow, and how much worse things have gotten. Our country has suffered from rising income inequality and chronically slow growth in the living standards of low and moderate income Americans. This disappointing living standards growth, which was in fact caused by rising income inequality, preceded the Great Recession and continues to this day. Fortunately, income inequality and middle-class living standards are now squarely on the political agenda. But despite their increasing salience, these issues are too often discussed in abstract terms. Ignored is the easy-to-understand root of rising income inequality, slow living standards growth, and a host of other key economic challenges. The near stagnation of hourly wage growth for the vast majority of American workers over the past generation. Countering that by generating broad-based wage growth is our core economic policy challenge. With a group of simple charts, this paper brings the challenge we face into sharp focus and lends clarity to the steps we must take to meet it. It should not be surprising that trends in hourly wage growth have profound consequences for American living standards. After all, the vast majority of Americans rely on their paychecks to make ends meet. For these families, the bulk of income comes from wages and employer-provided benefits, followed by other income sources linked to jobs such as wage-based tax credits, pensions, and social insurance. Wage-related income also accounts for the majority of total income among the bottom fifth of households. Wage stagnation for the vast majority was not created by abstract economic trends. Rather, wages were suppressed by policy choices made on behalf of those with the most income, wealth, and power. In the past few decades, the American economy generated lots of income and wealth that would have allowed substantial living standards gains for every family. The same is true looking forward. Overall income and wealth will continue to grow. The key economic policy question is whether we will adopt policies that enable everyone to participate in a shared prosperity, or whether the growth of income and wealth will continue to accrue excessively and disproportionately to the best off 1%. The first policy choice should be to quickly restore full employment. The Federal Reserve Board can do this by not raising interest rates and slowing the recovery in the name of fighting inflationary pressures until wage growth is much, much stronger. Congress and the president can pursue the return to full employment by making public investments that can create both jobs and future productivity growth. After this, policymakers should support those labor standards that can restore some bargaining power to low and moderate wage workers in coming years. That means policy actions such as passing a higher minimum wage, expanding rights to overtime pay, providing paid sick leave, protecting the labor rights of undocumented workers, and restoring the right to collective bargaining. Policymakers should reject trade treaties that provide corporations greater rights and sap our manufacturing job base. This is the first. The cost of inequality to middle-class households. The cost of unequal growth to middle-income households. This figure shows that the stakes of rising inequality for the broad American middle class are enormous. The figure compares the income growth of the middle 3/5 of American households since 1979 to their income growth had there been no growth in inequality. In 2007, the last year before the Great Recession, the average income of the middle 60% of American households was $76,443. It would have been $94,310, roughly 23%, nearly $18,000 higher had inequality not widened. Example, had their incomes grown at the overall average rate, an overall average buoyed by stratospheric growth at the very top. The temporary dip in top incomes during the Great Recession did little to shrink that inequality tax, which stood at 16%, nearly $12,000 in 2011. This is the figure. The U.S. middle class had $17,867 less income in 2007 because of the growth of inequality since 1979. So data shows average income of households in the middle 3/5. Source is EPI analysis of Congressional Budget Office data. Wow. Wage trends of the last 3 decades. The gap between the growth of productivity and that of a typical worker's pay. Slow and unequal wage growth in recent decades stems from a growing wedge between overall productivity, the improvements in the amount of goods and services produced per hour worked, and the pay, wages, and benefits received by a typical worker. The figure shows that in the 3 decades following World War II, hourly compensation of the vast majority of workers rose 91%, roughly in line with productivity growth of 97%. But for the most of the past generation, except for a brief period in the late 1990s, pay for the vast majority lagged further and further behind overall productivity. From 1973 to 2013, hourly compensation of a typical production non-supervisory worker rose just 9%, while productivity increased 74%. This breakdown of pay growth has been especially evident in the last decade, affecting both college and non-college educated workers, as well as blue and white collar workers. This means that workers have been producing far more than they receive in their paychecks and benefit packages from their employers. Workers produce much more, but typical workers' pay lagged far behind. Data are for compensation, wages, and benefits of production slash non-supervisory workers in the private sector and net productivity of the total economy. Net productivity is the growth of output of goods and services less depreciation per hour worked. Massive spike in productivity, especially from like 1973 to 2013, which is the end of this particular chart's data. And hourly compensation is roughly stagnated, barely changed at all. Wage growth of the top 1%, the ability of those at the very top to claim an ever larger share of overall wages is evident in this figure. 2 things stand out. First is the extraordinarily rapid growth of annual wages for the top 1% compared with everybody else. Top 1% wages grew 138%, while wages of the bottom 90% grew just 15%. If the wages of the bottom 90% had grown at the average pace over this period, meaning that wages grew equally across the board, then the bottom 90%'s wages would have grown by 32%, more than double the actual growth. When it comes to the pace of annual pay increases, the top 1% wage grew 138% since 1979, while wages for the bottom 90% grew 15%. EPI analysis of data from Kopskuk, Sayes, and Song, 2010, and Social Security Administration wage statistics. Stagnant wages for middle wage workers, declining wages for low wage workers. Over the entire 34-year period between 1979 and 2013, the hourly wages of middle wage workers, median wage workers who earned more than half the workforce but less than the other half, were stagnant, rising just 6%, less than 0.2% per year. This wage growth, in fact, occurred only because wages grew in the late 1990s when labor markets got tight enough. Unemployment, for instance, fell to 4% in the 1999 and 2000 to finally deliver across-the-board hourly wage growth. The wages of middle wage workers were totally flat or in decline over the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, except for the late 1990s. The wages of low-wage workers fared even worse, falling 5% from 1979 to 2013. In contrast, the hourly wages of high-wage workers rose 41%. Middle-class wages are stagnant. Middle-wage workers' hourly wage is up 6% since 1979. Low-wage workers' wages are down 5%, while those with very high wages saw a 41% increase. Cumulative change in real hourly wages of all workers by wage percentile, 1979 to 2013. Low wage is 10th percentile, middle wage is 50th percentile, very high wage is 95th percentile. Sources: EPI analysis of current population survey, outgoing rotation group microdata. The wage and benefit plight of recent college graduates. The widespread problem of stagnant hourly wages is not a problem of insufficiently skilled or uneducated educated workers. As this figure shows, a 4-year college degree has been no guarantee of decent wage growth. In 2013, inflation-adjusted hourly wages of young college graduates were lower than they were in the late 1990s, a trend that held for both young male and female college graduates. Thus, wage stagnation and erosion afflict even the 1/3 of workers who have earned a 4-year college degree. Wages of young college grads have been falling since 2000. Real average hourly wages of young college graduates, 1989 to 2014. Data are for college graduates age 21 to 24 who do not have an advanced degree and are not enrolled in further schooling. Data for 2014 represent 12-month average from April 2013 to March 2014. Shaded areas denote recessions. Recent college graduates have been less and less able to find jobs that provide health insurance. The share of young college graduates who have employer-sponsored health insurance coverage fell from 61% in 1989 to 31% by 2012. Most of this health benefit erosion occurred since 2000, when just over half, 53%, of recent college graduates had employer-provided health insurance. For high school graduates, the decline was even steeper, from 24% in 1989 to just 7% in 2012. Employers are cutting health care for young workers, both college and high school graduates. Share of employed recent high school and college graduates with health insurance provided by their own employer, 1989 to 2012. As you can see, that has declined quite a bit. Coverage is defined as being included in an employer-provided plan where the employer paid for at least some of the coverage. Data are for college graduates ages 21 to 24 who do not have an advanced degree and are not enrolled in further schooling, and high school graduates age 17 to 20 who are not enrolled in further schooling. Shaded areas denote recessions. Factors driving wage stagnation and inequality. CEO pay grabs at a larger share of wages. In a nation of increasing inequality, the most extreme wage disparities are between the heads of large American corporations and typical workers. This figure tracks the ratio of pays of CEOs at the 350 largest public U.S. firms to the pay of typical workers in those firms' industries. In 1965, these CEOs made 20 times what typical workers made. As of 2013, they made just about 300 times typical workers' pay. I'm going to go ahead and reread that one because it's very important. In 1965, these CEOs made 20 times what typical workers made. As of 2013, they make just under 300 times typical workers' pay. This higher pay for CEOs does not reflect any increased contribution to corporate output. Other data show that CEO grew 3 times faster than the pay of the top 0.1% of wage earners and twice as fast as corporate profits. Moreover, the rising pay of executives was the largest factor in the doubling of the top 0.1% and top 1% share of overall household income growth. CEO pay gains help explain the growing divergence between pay and productivity. CEOs now make 296 times what a typical worker earns. And I would just about guarantee that is far worse now. This ends in 2013. CEO annual compensation is computed using the options realized compensation series for CEOs at the top 350 U.S. firms ranked by sales. Typical worker compensation is average compensation of production, non-supervisory workers, and the key industries of the firms included in the sample. Damn, it was especially bad in like 2000 at 383 times. Policy choices regarding the minimum wage fuel wage inequality. While pay at the top of the labor market has outpaced nearly every labor market indicator for decades, pay at the bottom, the federal minimum wage, has severely lagged. This figure shows the decline in the real inflation-adjusted value of the minimum wage since its high in 1968, as well as what the federal minimum wage would be today if it had kept pace with the growth of real hourly wages of production and non-supervisory workers, who make up 80% of the workforce, or economy-wide productivity. Had the federal minimum wage kept pace with productivity, it would be over $18 today. Though not shown in the figure, the federal minimum wage did keep pace with productivity in the 30 years before 1968. The minimum wage essentially establishes the wage levels of the bottom fifth of wage earners. These low wage workers are far more educated and are older than low wage workers in 1968. Yet, despite being more skilled and productive, the wages they earn are lower than wages earned in 1968. The failure to raise the minimum wage had especially adverse effects on women and minority workers. The minimum wage would be over $18 had it risen along with productivity. Real value of the federal minimum wage compared with its value had it grown at the rate of productivity and average hourly wages, 1968 to 2014. Real average hourly wages are of production non-supervisory workers in the private sector, and productivity is net productivity of the total economy. The erosion of collective bargaining hurts all workers. One of the main causes of stagnant wages and rising wage inequality is the decline of collective bargaining, which has lowered the wages of both union and non-union workers. The figure shows that the drop in the share of workers under collective bargaining contract is the mirror image of the rise of incomes of the top 10%. This occurs because collective bargaining not only raises wages for organized workers, but also leads other employers to raise the wages and benefits of non-union workers to come closer to union wage standards. This phenomenon occurs when collective bargaining achieves even modest penetration. The erosion of collective bargaining can explain from 1/4 to 1/3 of the growth of wage inequality between 1973 and 2007 and had a greater impact on men than women. This erosion of collective bargaining occurred despite large numbers of workers indicating they would prefer collective bargaining if they had a choice. But the political power of those with the most income, wealth, and power prevented the adoption of laws to modernize our labor management system and enable workers to pursue collective bargaining. Decline in union membership mirrors income gains of the top 10%. Union membership and share of income going to the top 10%, 1917 to 2012. The dark blue line is share of income going to the top 10%. The light blue line is union membership share, and it's almost a perfect mirror. Data on union density follow the composite series found in Historical Statistics of the United States, updated to 2012 from unionstats.com. Income inequality, share of income to top 10%. From Piketty and Say's Income Inequality in the United States, 1913 to 1998, Quarterly Journal of Economics, 118-1, 2003, 1 through 39. Updated and downloadable data for this series and other countries are available at, and then it sends you to a link, updated September 2013. Other factors behind stagnating American wages. This paper provides a brief overview of some of the causes of wage stagnation and inequality. Sources in the references section provide a more complete analysis. Excessive unemployment, not only during and after the Great Recession, but over most years since 1979, has suppressed wage growth, adversely affecting low-wage workers more than middle-wage workers, but having little impact on high-wage workers. Global integration with low-wage countries accelerated by particular trade policies, example admission of China to the World Trade Organization in the late 1990s, has adversely affected wages of non-college educated workers. The erosion of labor standards, beyond the decline in the real value of the minimum wage, and weak enforcement have also put downward pressure on wages. Extensive wage theft, worker misclassification, weakened prevailing wage laws and overtime protections, and the failure to modernize our labor standards to provide sick leave, family leave, or minimum vacation schedules all hurt wage growth. The increased presence of undocumented workers who are vulnerable to employer exploitation also undercuts not only the wages of these workers, but also those in similar fields. That is the end of this one. Wrapping up now. This is a chart from CBPP calculations based on U.S. Census Bureau data. Income gains widely shared in early post-war decades, but not since then. Real family income between 1947 and 2023 as a percentage of 1973 level. So the blue line is the 20th percentile. The gold line is median, and the red line is the 95th percentile. As you can see, right about here in 1980, roughly, is when there's a massive divergence and everything starts unraveling. And of course, income inequality keeps on skyrocketing and breaking further apart. So why is that? What happened in 1980? Normally, I don't share Google AI, but I will this time. Multiple factors converged around 1980 to accelerate income inequality, with the shift toward conservative economic policies, particularly those of Reaganomics, being a central cause. These policies, combined with the decline of labor unions, increased globalization and technological changes, disproportionately benefited the wealthy, while wages for the middle and lower classes stagnated. Policy shifts. Reagan's tax cuts, the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 and the Tax Reform Act of 1986 drastically reduced the top marginal tax rate and corporate taxes. The premise of trickle-down economics, that these benefits would be passed on to average workers, did not materialize. Instead, the tax cuts primarily benefited high-income earners and contributed to a soaring national debt. Deregulation. During the 1980s, the Reagan administration loosened or eliminated regulations on financial markets, leading to increased speculation and financial instability. This financialization of the economy shifted profits towards financial services rather than productive investments, boosting the earnings of financial professionals and the very top earners. Cuts to social spending. The Reagan administration scaled back welfare programs and other income transfer policies. This, combined with tax cuts, helped increase both poverty and inequality as the social safety net weakened for those most in need. Changes in the labor market. Decline of labor unions. Beginning in 1981, the Reagan administration launched a campaign against organized labor, including famously firing striking air traffic controllers. This signaled a political assault on union strength, which subsequently entered a steep decline because unions historically helped secure better wages and benefits for low and middle wage earners. Their erosion is estimated to account for a significant portion of the rise in wage inequality. Manufacturing decline. During the early 1980s recession, goods producing industries that traditionally had high union membership lost 1.4 million jobs. The subsequent economic recovery saw robust job growth in less unionized service industries, further shifting employment away from unionized sectors and accelerating the decline in organized labor. Broader economic shifts. Technological change. The increasing use of computers and other information technologies throughout the 1980s and beyond boosted demand for high-skilled workers, while wages and employment grew for those with the skills to use this new technology. Lower-skilled workers saw a fall in wages and job availability. This skill-biased technological change accelerated wage inequality. Increased globalization. The 1980s marked a period of increasing economic integration across international borders through trade, finance, and labor. While this accelerated economic growth in some developing countries, within many developed nations like the US, it put downward pressure on wages for lower skilled workers due to increased international competition. Recession and austerity. The recessions of the early 1980s hit lower income households and minorities the hardest, and they experienced the most persistent earnings declines. In the context of the new economic policies, austerity measures and high unemployment further exacerbated inequality. That's mainly what I wanted to share with you. And notice the central trend there in the last little bit that I shared, and that is Reagan. There are still so many people, especially on the right, that champion Reagan as like one of the best things to ever happen to this country. Not even fucking close. He was very charismatic and knew how to sell bullshit. And you guys fell for it. At least some of you did. Reagan is one of the worst things to ever happen to this country. And right now, Donald Trump is mimicking many of his policies and his whole ideology toward governance. Neoliberalism is destroying the United States, and it's ratcheting up. We're seeing more of it right now. So we are far worse off in terms of purchasing power, wages, cost of basic shit. It's not even close. Like, it continues to get worse and worse. And with basically, we have absolutely no voice right now. We have legal bribery after Citizens United, and lobbyists can just throw unlimited money at politicians and make sure that we don't get shit. I don't see it changing anytime soon. Not without some form of like massive revolution or some shit, and I don't think enough people are ready for that. So it will more than likely continue to get worse and worse, especially when people are being brainwashed by complete idiots like Donald Trump, who has absolutely no idea what he's doing. But even if he did, the American people are not his interest. Like every policy decision he has made shows that very clearly. But some of you don't care about facts. You're more emotional in nature. You just like the way he talks, like he speaks on a third grade level. That's appealing to some of you. But actual facts, objective data, and on the ground shit that affects everyone, things are worse, way worse off now than they were back in the 50s and 60s and even beyond. So, like, subscribe, share, ring that bell. I'm looking to grow, and I do not monetize. Even if I ever do decide to monetize in the future, I will be basically taking poverty wages, which will be extremely transparent, and I'll probably upload information like monthly to share with you if I ever decide to do that. A huge majority of any income in the far future, at least according to my plans, I think I'm going to end up going with this. It's going to be donated to charity. And of course, I'll share exactly which charities with you and all that good stuff. I do not and will not ever accept corporate sponsorship. Thank you for your time.